They tell me, love is enough. They say it like it's a bandage that sticks no matter how deep the cut, like it can outrun distance, or time, or truth. But I've lived long enough to know better. Love doesn't always get the last word. Sometimes, love just sits in the back seat. Quiet, faithful, watching the people it raised walk away without ever turning around. I was standing in a house I didn't recognize. One of those modern, echoey places with too much marble and not enough warmth. I'd brought a gift with me, something small, wrapped in newspaper I saved from his graduation day. It still had the photograph of him in his cap and gown, smiling like he hadn't yet tasted disappointment. The corners were yellowing. I'd folded it 3 times and tied it with a bit of twine from the drawer next to the flower, and there he was, standing tall and polished, in a suit I couldn't afford to brush lint off of, with a woman who looked like she had never scrubbed a dish in her life. Her nails were pink and perfect, her voice all satin and champagne. "This is just someone from the past," he said. He didn't even look at me when he said it. He was looking at her. He was smiling, and I just stood there. My coat still smelled of attic dust and lavender, the hem stiffed with salt from the winter. Walked to the train station. I had worried it might be too heavy for the visit. Funny what we worry about when we don't know what's really coming. Just someone from the past. My dears, I didn't give birth to him. No, but I fed him when he wouldn't eat. I changed his sheets when he had nightmares, and wet the bed. I made paper crowns for his birthday and stuck them on his head while he laughed with cake in his teeth. I stitched the holes in his socks, even when my fingers were too stiff from arthritis to thread the needle without squinting. I stood in the doorway when he left for prom. I held the camera. I cheered louder than anyone when he got that scholarship. And when he called me mama for the first time, I went to the bathroom, shut the door, and wept until my knees gave out. So no, I didn't carry him in my body, but I carried him. Through years of cold winters and harder summers, I carried that boy, every scraped knee, every teacher's note, every tear he tried to hide in his pillow when his friends outgrew him or forgot to invite him. I carried it all, and still, I became someone from the past. That's the part they never tell you, sweethearts. It's not the noise that hurts the most, not the colic or the slammed doors. It's the silence that comes later, the forgetting, the way they rewrite the story to fit the life they want now. Edited, with no room for the people who held them when they were small and broken. It doesn't happen all at once. No. First it's a missed birthday, then a call that comes 3 weeks too late, a holiday skipped, a sorry, I've just been so busy, and you tell yourself they love you. You remind yourself of everything you did. You wait, you forgive, until the day they look you in the face, or worse, don't, and call you a memory, a relic, a page they've already turned. You start to wonder if you imagined it all, but I didn't. I know what I gave. I know what it cost me. And before I tell you the rest, before I take you back to the creaky floors and cotton aprons, to the cinnamon in the air and the gospel records spinning on Sunday mornings, I need you to know this isn't a story wrapped in bows. There's no neat ending here, no redemption arc, just truth. Before I begin, my dears, like the video, subscribe, and leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. Some stories must be told, even if they still hurt, because this one lives in the softest part of me, the part that still believes in love, even when love forgets your name. I was born in the spring of 1939, in a town so small you could walk from one end to the other without ever losing the scent of chimney smoke or fried potatoes. Back then, we didn't have much, but we had rhythm, morning chores, evening prayers, and the sound of the screen door creaking open just before supper. The house I grew up in sat on the edge of a gravel road lined with cottonwoods that whispered all day and moaned at night. Mama said the trees were old women, gossiping to each other when the wind picked up. I used to sit on the porch with my knees tucked under my chin and listened for secrets in their rustling. My daddy was a quiet man, not from lack of love but from too many early losses. He worked at the feed mill and always came home with the scent of grain in his clothes and dust in the folds of his knuckles. He'd kiss Mama on the cheek, never the lips, not in front of us, and she'd hand him a mug of chicory coffee, black as coal and strong enough to make your eyes water. We lived simple, 1 bathroom, 2 bedrooms, no locks on the doors, because who would steal from folks who didn't have anything? The smell of lye soap clung to our towels, and our quilts were patched with fabric from old flour sacks and worn Sunday dresses. Mama played hymns on the old upright piano in the parlor, sometimes after dinner. When the dishes were washed and the boys were outside catching fireflies, she'd play in the garden, or How Great Thou Art, her fingers slow and reverent, like the keys might break if she rushed. Her voice was shaky, but it held something sacred, a kind of remembering, like she was singing to folks who'd already gone on ahead. We weren't allowed to speak during supper. Daddy said the food needed respect, and he was right. In his way, that meatloaf stretched thin with breadcrumbs, those boiled potatoes with a dab of margarine, that pot of stewed okra with tomatoes from the garden, it was sacred. Every bite came from someone's back or blistered hands. Saturdays were for chores, church clothes laid out on the line, and the smell of vinegar and baking bread curling up through the windows. Sundays were the one day Mama would wear her blue brooch, the one with the fake pearl in the middle, and I'd sit next to her in the pew and sneak glances at it whenever the sermon dragged on too long. School was a red brick building with 4 rooms and windows so tall they caught every season as it passed. I loved learning, but more than that, I loved stories. I'd stay after to help Miss Evelyn erase the blackboard, just so she'd tell me tales about her brother who'd gone off to fight in the Great War, or the time the river rose so high it swallowed the Johnsons' barn. We grew up with calloused palms and straight spines. Girls were taught to be quiet, polite, and useful. Boys got away with more, always had, but I didn't mind much. I found joy in small things, shelling peas with Aunt Jo on the porch, hanging wet sheets that flapped like ghosts in the wind, and the way Daddy's eyes crinkled when he listened to the Grand Ole Opry with his feet propped on an apple crate, and, at night, when the lamp oil burned low and the frogs outside croaked their lullabies, I'd lie in bed and feel safe, entirely, completely safe, before the world changed, before I had to become more than a daughter, more than a girl, before I knew that love could turn and walk away. I still remember the tin roof over our kitchen. When it rained, it sang, not a sad song, more like a lullaby. You could feel in your bones. I'd press my ear to the wood floor and listen to the rhythm of it, pretending the drops were tiny dancers tapping across the sky, just for me. Our kitchen was the heart of everything. Mornings smelled like bacon, grease and cornbread. We didn't have fancy coffee makers, just a chipped kettle that whistled like an old man with a missing tooth. Mama's hands were always moving, flipping bunny cakes, canning peaches, ironing Daddy's shirts, with that heavy block of iron you had to heat right on the stove. Sometimes, if we had a good crop that year, or Daddy came home with a few extra nickels from overtime, Mama would let us bake something sweet, apple brown Betty, vinegar pie, or molasses cookies that stuck to your teeth. She'd hum while she cooked, always the same tune, "You Are My Sunshine." That melody still haunts me. I can't hear it now, without my throat tightening. Our neighbors were mostly kin. My Uncle Henry lived 3 houses down, always working on a broken tractor that never did run right. He was one of those men who'd fix anything except the things that mattered, like his temper, or his drinking. But he loved us kids, in his own quiet way. He'd slip me a butterscotch when Mama wasn't looking, and I'd pretend I didn't see the bruises on Aunt Claire's arm. No one talked about things back then. If a marriage soured, if a boy got too handsy, if someone disappeared for a while and came back looking thinner and quieter, it was all swept under the quilt of none of our business. We were raised to survive, not to ask. I was 12 when I first bled. Mama didn't explain much. She just handed me a rag, lit a candle, and told me not to ride horses for a few days. That was how we learned, by watching, guessing, stitching meaning together like scraps. Summers were golden, not the kind you see in postcards, but real summers. Dust in your lungs, cicadas singing loud enough to drown out your thoughts, heat so thick it sat on your skin like a blanket straight from the fire. We'd make fans out of cardboard, steal sips of iced tea when no one was watching, and swing from the tire rope out back until our palms blistered. And oh, the county fair, once a year, the whole town turned into a dream. Candy apples, the smell of sawdust and roasted peanuts, ribbons tied to everything that would hold still. I wore my best dress, white with blue polka dots, and Daddy let me have one ride on the Ferris wheel, up there, in the rusted cradle of that creaky wheel. I felt like the world couldn't touch me, just sky, wind, and the lights below flickering like fireflies. There was a boy I liked back then, Clay MacArthur. He had sandy hair and a laugh like a gravel road, rough but good. He gave me a penny once, shiny and new, and said it was lucky. I kept it in a matchbox under my pillow for years, but he moved away the following spring. That's how life went. In our town, people either stayed and grew roots, or they vanished like fog off the fields. Mama used to say I was born with an old soul. I liked quiet. I liked folding things, sheets, stories, hopes. I'd sit with the widows at church and listen to them talk about gardens and loss like they were the same thing. I never minded being still. I never minded waiting. And for a long time, I thought that if you gave your heart patiently, slowly, gently, faithfully, it would come back to you whole. I didn't know yet that some people only borrow love, that they take it, build a life on it, and then forget who handed it to them in the first place. I always believed a good day began with warm bread. That's how Mama did it. She'd rise before dawn, tie back her hair, and start kneading like it was a prayer. The kitchen filled with that soft, yeasty air that made you want to sit quiet and wait for the world to open its eyes. The dough would rise in a big ceramic bowl covered with a tea towel that had once been a flour sack, and I remember tracing the fading letters on it while Mama stirred something else on the stove. Life was measured in seasons and chores. Mondays were for laundry, the kind you ran through a wringer and hung on a line until the wind gave it back to you dry. Tuesdays were for ironing. Wednesdays, the floors. Thursdays, baking. Fridays, sewing and mending. Saturdays, yard work and hair trims in the kitchen chair. And Sunday, well, Sunday was for the Lord. We didn't have fancy clothes, but we had clean ones. I remember the way Mama would press my dress collar just right, spit shine my shoes, and tie my hair back with a ribbon that matched the one she wore. It was important, she said, to walk into church like you respected yourself even if the roof leaked at home. Church smelled like beeswax, hymnals, and too much perfume from the older ladies. I'd sit between Mama and Daddy, swinging my legs until Mama tapped my knee. The preacher's voice thundered, but what I liked most were the songs. I knew every verse of I'll Fly Away and Amazing Grace by heart before I turned 10. When I was little, I thought faith was a ladder. You just kept climbing, step after step, until you reached the light. Later, I learned faith is more like a rope in the dark. You hold on and hope it leads somewhere, anywhere. We didn't have television, just a radio Mama called our window to the world. She'd tune it in, while snapping beans or peeling apples, the static dancing with the voices of strangers. Sometimes it was news, sometimes it was Hank Williams or Patsy Cline. But my favorite nights were when Daddy would lean back in his chair and tap his foot to the rhythm, humming low like a man who still remembered dancing. He wasn't always easy. Daddy, there were nights when the weight of the world sat too heavy on his chest, and he'd go silent, eyes glassy, staring out past the porch like he was remembering something no one else could see. War changes men, Mama said. He never talked about the Pacific, but sometimes when I'd pass by their room, I'd hear her whispering to him in the dark, calming him like you would a frightened animal. He never laid a hand on any of us, but he carried sadness the way some men carry pride, always there, always, just under the surface. I think that's why I learned to carry quiet, too. By the time I was 16, I could gut a chicken, hem a dress, and comfort a child all before breakfast. I worked at the local store after school, Mr. Holder's General, sweeping the floors, stocking shelves, and ringing up penny candies for sticky-fingered children. He paid me 75 cents a day, and sometimes let me take home bruised apples or dented tins. Mama said I was the kind of girl a man would be lucky to marry, but I didn't think much of marrying. I liked helping, I liked mattering, I didn't have big dreams. I didn't want to run off to the city, or chase movie stars. I wanted a life like Mama's hard, maybe, but honest. A house with a porch, a man who came home, children who knew their supper would always be warm. The summer I turned 18, the world felt like it was holding its breath. Boys were heading off to Korea. The town was changing, paved roads, new gas pumps, a second telephone line installed down by the schoolhouse. I got a letter from a cousin in Memphis who said city girls wore lipstick and smoked cigarettes in public. I couldn't imagine it. I still felt like a child in hand-me-down skirts, still walking barefoot through duet grass every morning. Then came the letter. A neighbor girl, younger than me, had gotten herself in trouble. That's how they said it then. In trouble. No one said pregnant. No one said scared. She was sent away to a home run by nuns out in the hills, and when she came back, there was no baby, no explanation, just hollow eyes and hands that trembled while she poured lemonade at the church picnic. I didn't understand it fully, but I remember watching her from across the lawn, wondering how a girl could lose so much and still smile. It planted something in me, a question I couldn't name, a kind of quiet terror that maybe life wasn't as simple as it looked from the kitchen window. Still, I held to my rhythms: work, home, church, sleep. I watched Mama age before I was ready. Her hands grew stiff, her back bent, and I started doing more without her asking. She'd watch me sometimes with this soft sadness in her eyes, like she knew time was getting short and I was becoming her. When Daddy died, heart attack, quick as a snap, we didn't cry loud. We baked a ham. We ironed black dresses. We shook hands at the service and said the right things. But that night, after the neighbors left and the casseroles cooled untouched, on the sideboard, Mama let out a sound I'll never forget. Like something tearing inside her. I held her, and for the first time, she felt small. I was 21 when she passed, just a few years between their deaths, but it aged me fast. 1 minute, I was someone's daughter. The next, I was alone. No one to ask about gravy lumps or garden pests, or what to do when your stomach twists in the middle of the night and sleep won't come. And still, I wasn't bitter. I was lonely, yes, but I believed life would begin. Again, I believed, with all my foolish, hopeful heart, that love would find me, that I'd make a family of my own, with laughter in the hallway and muddy boots by the door. I didn't know yet that the family I'd build would come to me another way, not through birth, but through choice and love. The kind that asks everything of you, and still keeps asking, but that came later. Back then, I was just a girl with a good set of hands, a tidy apron, and a heart full of room for someone else's child. It began with a knock on the door, not loud, not urgent, just a slow, polite tapping like someone unsure if they should be there at all. I was in the kitchen folding towels, the scent of stew simmering on the stove, and late October wind whistling through the window seams. I remember the way the curtain danced. I remember the feel of flour still on my hands. Funny how small things stitch themselves into memory when everything else unravels. I opened the door expecting a neighbor, maybe one of the McHenry boys trying to sell pecans for school, but instead, there stood a girl I'd never seen before. She couldn't have been older than 17, pale eyes too big for her face, hair pulled back in a messy braid that had come loose near the temple. She wore a dress too thin for the season, and she was holding something, someone wrapped in a yellow crocheted blanket. A baby. She didn't say a word at first, just looked at me, like I was the last door on a very long road. Then she said, barely above a whisper, "He said you'd know what to do." She didn't say who he was. She didn't have to. I knew. My brother James, who hadn't written in 6 months. James, who always had a way of charming girls with those dimples and that lazy smile. James, who had a habit of running when things got hard. I hadn't seen him since the summer, when he'd come through town on his way to Chicago for work. He'd kissed my cheek, told me I looked just like Mama used to, and left with more promises than luggage. I hadn't expected him back, but I never expected this either. "I'm not asking for anything," the girl said quickly. I can't keep him. I can't go home. They said they'd send me to the asylum if I did." Her voice trembled. She looked past me, like she couldn't bear to look me in the eye. "I don't want him to end up like me. Please," the baby squirmed. In her arms, a little bundle of soft skin and startled breaths. His eyes were shut tight. He let out a sharp, hiccup-y cry, and something in me split clean down the middle. "I don't have anywhere else," she whispered. There was silence between us for a moment. Only the wind and the soft gurgle of stew behind me. I should have asked questions. I should have said no, but instead, I stepped aside and opened the door wider. "Come in," I said. "Let's get you warm." She sat stiffly in the kitchen chair, eyes darting from corner to corner, like she was memorizing the way out. Just in case, I wrapped a quilt around her shoulders and poured her a cup of tea. Hot, too strong, but it was all I had. She cradled it with trembling hands like it was the only thing anchoring her to the world. The baby had stopped crying. I'd offered to hold him while she drank, and though her arms hesitated, she passed him to me like someone surrendering a part of herself. He was so small, warm. He smelled like old milk and something soft, like a drawer full of flannel. His little fingers kept curling and uncurling, searching the air like they were looking for something they'd already lost. "What's his name?" I asked gently. She blinked, then looked down into her tea. "Thomas," I nodded. "That's a strong name." Silence. Then, she said it so quietly, I almost didn't catch it. "I haven't told anyone he's gone." I set the mug down. "Where are you staying?" She shook her head. "I don't know. I was at a boarding house, but I left. They'd ask questions. Do your parents know?" She laughed, not cruelly, just tired. "They said I was dead to them." My stomach dropped. I looked at her. really looked at her, and saw not a foolish girl, but a ghost of someone who'd been loved and then dropped like a stone. She didn't have to explain. Back then, you didn't come home pregnant and unmarried. Girls like her were sent away, whispered about, forgotten, their babies. Well, those babies either disappeared into orphanages or into stories nobody dared finish. And here she was, no ring, no suitcase, just a name she whispered into my kitchen, and a baby she loved too much to abandon but not enough to believe she could raise him. Is James really the father? I asked after a long pause. She nodded once. He promised he'd send for me. He promised. My heart sank. James made promises the way other men smoked cigarettes, careless and often, and just like that, she stood up, wrapped the quilt tighter around her, and said, I'm sorry. I blinked. Wait, but she was already moving, her steps fast, light, desperate. She paused only once, at the door, didn't look back. Tell him I tried, and then she was gone. For a moment, everything stood still. The baby Thomas stirred. In my arms, I looked down at him, and he looked back, his eyes as dark and wide as a moonless sky, and in that second, I knew, I didn't choose him, but I wasn't going to let the world chew him up the way it had her. I didn't go to bed that night. I sat in the rocking chair with him against my chest, humming low, the way Mama used to when I was feverish. The hours passed like waves, long, slow, heavy, and when the sun began to rise through the kitchen window, I knew I was already someone different than I'd been the day before. I was a mother now, whether I wanted to be or not. The next days blurred together, feedings, changings, baths in the sink, middle of a night cries that tore through the silence like thunder. I found bottles at the corner store and old cloth diapers from the attic. I stitched soft mittens to keep his hands warm and wrapped him in Mama's old nightgowns, tied at the bottom to keep the chill out. People noticed, of course. The neighbors asked. The church ladies murmured. There were questions disguised as kindness. Whose baby is that? Just visiting. Oh my, he looks just like you did as a baby. I didn't offer answers. Let them wonder. Let them gossip. All I cared about was keeping him fed, warm, loved. At night, when the wind rattled the window panes and I was too tired to cry, I would rock him and whisper all the things I wished someone had whispered to that girl. You are safe. You are wanted. You are not a mistake. I wrote James a letter, told him to come, told him I wasn't mad, not yet, just confused, just scared. I sent it to the address he'd scribbled on the back of a postcard last year. It came back 3 weeks later, unopened, returned to sender. That was the last time I tried. I named myself, his mother, not out loud, not in front of anyone, just in the way I moved, the way I folded his clothes and cut his food into tiny squares, the way I memorized the sounds of his breathing, the way I kissed the top of his head and closed my eyes like a prayer. It wasn't easy, my dears, Lord, no. There were days I thought I'd lose my mind, days when the only sound in the house was his crying and the ticking of the kitchen clock, days when I'd stare at myself in the mirror and see a girl pretending to be a woman, and a woman pretending not to be afraid, but there was joy too. The first time he laughed, a real laugh, deep from the belly, I dropped the spoon I was holding and just stood there, my hands over my mouth, eyes flooding. The first time he said Mama, I sat on the porch steps long after he'd gone to bed, staring up at the stars and trying to believe it. The world hadn't just shifted, it had rebuilt itself around him. The trouble didn't come all at once. It began like a splinter, under the skin, small, barely there, then suddenly, everything stung. It started with a knock on the door, one gray morning. I'd just gotten Thomas down for a nap, his little fist curled beneath his cheek, the room still smelling of lavender soap and milk. I opened the door and found Pastor Willis and his wife standing there, not smiling, not frowning either, just braced. May we come in? He asked, his hat in hand. I nodded, stepped aside, and tucked my apron tighter at the waist, already knowing. We sat in the parlor. I poured tea. The silence between sips was louder than their words. We've heard some things, his wife said gently, folding her gloved hands in her lap. About a child, a boy, the pastor added, belonging to your brother. I held the cup to my lips, but didn't drink. My heart was thudding in my ears. They didn't come to ask. They came to decide. The pastor cleared his throat. Is it true? Did your brother father a child out of wedlock? I didn't answer. Instead, I asked, does it matter who fathered him? They blinked, caught off guard. He's a child, I said softly. Innocent, loved, safe. Is he yours? She asked. My voice cracked. He is now. They sat back. The pastor's lips twitched like he wanted to speak but wasn't sure how. His wife leaned forward instead. People are talking, darling. You know how this town is. They're saying you've taken in a bastard child, and worse, that you're hiding something. I'm not hiding, I whispered. I'm protecting. Then you need to tell the truth. I looked her in the eye, and what truth would make it acceptable? She had no answer. So they left, with polite nods and tight smiles and a Bible verse about integrity. But the damage was done. The whispers grew teeth. At the grocer's, people stopped me less. Some crossed to the other aisle. A woman at the fabric shop took back a compliment on Thomas's sweater when she realized who I was. The worst came from my own family. Aunt May arrived from 2 towns over, arms folded like she was carrying a ledger instead of a purse. She didn't sit, just stood in the middle of my kitchen and delivered her verdict. You've ruined your name. I didn't respond. You've made yourself a pariah. For what? Someone else's mistake. He's not a mistake, I said, trembling. He's not yours either. I turned away. But she grabbed my wrist. You're not married. You've got no job, no savings. What future can you offer him? I pulled free, a better one than he had. She scoffed. You'll see. One day he'll grow up and ask questions, and when he finds out what you kept from him. She didn't finish. She didn't need to. The seed was planted. That night, I lay awake. Thomas pressed to my chest, his breath soft and warm against my collarbone. What if she was right? What if one day he resented me? What if I'd built this fragile love on a foundation of someone else's silence? I wept, silently, so as not to wake him. I cried for the girl who'd fled into my kitchen, for the brother who never showed up, for the life I once imagined, the one with dances, laughter, a husband whose promises were made of more than air, but mostly, I cried because I loved him, more than I had ever loved anything, and love, real love, doesn't wait to be invited, it shows up and stays, even when the house burns down. The choice came one Sunday afternoon. I was on the porch, shelling peas with Thomas in my lap, when I saw the black car roll up the drive, polished, government plates, the kind that made your heart sink before your brain caught up. 2 women stepped out, clean coats, hard shoes, folders in their hands, child services. They introduced themselves kindly, too kindly. We received a report. One said, an anonymous tip. I didn't have to guess who it was. They wanted to ask questions, see the child's sleeping quarters, review documentation, birth certificate, custody papers. I had none. What relation is he to you? I'm his aunt, I whispered. They glanced at each other. Biological. I hesitated. No. They looked around the porch, the peeling paint, the empty cradle beside me. They were gentle, but they were unshakable. Unless legal custody is transferred, we'll have to place the child in foster care until proper arrangements are made. Foster care. The words felt like knives. I can apply for guardianship, I said quickly. I have letters. I can write affidavits. Please, don't take him tonight. They looked at me for a long moment. Then one said, we'll give you until Monday. That weekend was the longest of my life. I wrote every letter, called in every favor, begged the town clerk to work after hours, filed paperwork with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. I called a lawyer I couldn't afford, sold Mama's brooch to pay him, and when Monday came, I was waiting with Thomas in my lap, all my papers in a neat folder, ironed and labeled and trembling with hope. They read through them slowly, asked the same questions again, then again. I answered them all, and, at the end, one of the women, the younger one, looked at me and said softly, you've done everything right, you clearly love him, and then she nodded, just once. Like a gavel dropping, I wept into my apron, rocking back and forth as Thomas giggled on my knee, unaware of how close the world came to taking him away. That was the day I stopped waiting for someone to come claim him. He was mine, not by blood, but by every bottle, every night cry, every fevered brow I cooled with trembling hands. I named him Thomas James, because even though my brother never came for him, I wanted the boy to know where he came from, even if it hurt, even if one day he would ask and I would have to tell him the truth. But not yet, not while he was still small enough to fit in the crook of my arm, not while he still reached for me in the night. So, sweethearts, that's how the world shifted, not in a great explosion, but in a quiet, slow unraveling. A life I didn't choose became the only one that made sense. I buried the girl I had been, and gave birth to the woman I had to become. Whether anyone approved or not, it didn't happen all at once. No, Betrayals rarely do. They come quiet, don't they? Like water seeping under the door during a storm. At first, it's just a damp patch, easy to ignore. Then your socks are wet. Then the floorboards swell. And by the time you realize it's flooding, the damage has already reached your bones. That's how it felt with them. At first, it was little things. Comments I wasn't meant to hear. Sideways glances when I entered the room. I'd walk into the living room, and their voices would shift. The laughter would stop, or worse, it would go on just the same, but with a hollow edge that told me it had never been meant for me. I remember the first time I truly felt it. We were all at the dinner table. Me, Sarah, Thomas, their 3 children, and little Daniel, who I'd raised like he was my own blood. I had made meatloaf, the way Sarah used to like it when she was little, soft in the middle, crusty edges, a bit of brown sugar in the glaze. I even folded the napkins into little triangles, just like Mama taught me, but no one said a word, not about the food, not about the weather, not about anything. They just ate. Forks scraping plates, glasses clinking, the hum of the refrigerator filling all the spaces where warmth used to live. Then, Sarah leaned over to Thomas and said, plain as daylight, she doesn't even realize we don't need her anymore. She didn't whisper it. She didn't say it with malice either. She said it like a fact. Like you'd say the sky's turning gray or supper's gone cold. I didn't drop my fork. I didn't cry. I just kept chewing meat gone dry in my mouth, and something inside me turned to ash. The children didn't look up. Not one of them. Even Daniel. He kept staring at his plate like he hadn't heard. But I saw it in the way his shoulders tensed. He heard. They all did. Later that night, after the dishes were done and the lights dimmed, I sat alone in the laundry room, folding towels just to feel useful. The house had gone quiet, and I could hear the creak of the floorboards upstairs as everyone got ready for bed. I used to be the one who tucked Sarah in, sang her the lullaby Mama once sang to me. Hush, now, darling, stars are near. But now, my voice wasn't asked for. That was the night I realized I had become a ghost in my own family, still living, still breathing, but no longer seen. It was a Thursday when the final thread snapped. Not a date you'd circle on a calendar, not a stormy day or some dramatic event, just one of those soft, forgettable afternoons that end up scarring you for life. The town was hosting its little spring fair, the same one I'd taken Sarah to every year when she was small. She used to wear those pink barrettes with tiny strawberries on them, and I'd buy her candied apples and walk hand in hand through the maze of paper lanterns and burlap stalls. Now, she had her own family, and I was simply tagging along. I had brought the quilt, the one I made for her wedding, every square stitched from old dresses, baby blankets, even her father's shirts, pieces of our life, sewn together with swollen fingers and quiet prayers. It had taken me 3 months and 2 broken needles to finish it. I brought it to the fair because they were doing this little showcase, heritage crafts, they called it, and Sarah insisted I display it. People might like seeing something old-fashioned, she'd said, brushing it off like she was talking about a thrift store find. I laid it across the wooden frame with care. I watched people pass by, running their fingers across the seams, admiring the detail. A few even asked who made it, and before I could open my mouth, Sarah would lean in and say, sweet as sugar, oh, it's just something we found at an estate sale. An estate sale, like I was dead already. I stood there, a smile nailed to my face, while the world passed by me. My hands, the same ones that rocked her to sleep, spooned medicine into her mouth, wiped away her fevers, were suddenly invisible. She never even glanced at me, not once. I left early that day. I told them I wasn't feeling well, which wasn't a lie, just not the whole truth. The truth was, something had cracked, deep and permanent, the kind of crack you can't plaster over. I walked home slow, every step a little heavier than the last. When I reached the porch, I sat in the rocker and stared at my hands. These old hands, I used to think they were magic. They could braid hair, knead dough, press a shirt so flat you could cut your eye on the crease. Now, they just look empty. The next morning, I found the quilt rolled up in the garage beside the trash bins. No note, no thanks, just tossed there like a thing no one had use for. I didn't cry, but something in me went still, like a clock that decides it's done ticking. There's more, my dear, much more. The silence that followed. The days when even the walls stopped echoing back my voice. The moment I reached for Daniel, and even he stepped away. I didn't ask her why she threw the quilt away. I didn't need to. There's a silence that settles between people. heavier than words, and in that silence, I heard everything. I heard the embarrassment she felt, the shame maybe, or perhaps just the indifference. I heard the way she'd rewritten our story, smoothing the rough edges so it fit better into the life she had built. The one where I was a blurry background figure. Not the woman who once carried her through fevers and midnight sobs and heartbreaks she thought would never heal. It was the little things after that. Not loud betrayals, not slamming doors or screaming matches, just erasures, small omissions, like a name crossed out of a family Bible. She stopped bringing the grandchildren by. At first, it was excuses, too much homework, soccer practice, a cold going around. Then, it was nothing, just a quiet calendar, day after day, where no one knocked and the phone sat silent on the hook like it had died in its sleep. I called once, just once. Sarah's husband answered. He said, "She's busy right now. I'll let her know you called." But no one ever called back, and I didn't call again. You might wonder why. Why an old woman wouldn't fight harder to be seen, to be heard. But I wasn't always old, you know. I'd had a lifetime of swallowing pain and pretending it tasted sweet, and by then, I had learned, when people stop loving you out loud, chasing them only makes you look more invisible. So I waited. I waited for birthdays, for holidays, for someone to remember that I existed, and every year, the house grew quieter. Dust began to settle on places that used to sing with life, the kitchen, where I used to bake pies with cinnamon so strong it clung to the curtains for days, the living room, where we'd gather every Christmas, laughter rising like steam off a fresh cup of cocoa. One day, I opened the closet and found Daniel's coat still hanging there, the one he wore to Sarah's wedding. I ran my hand down the wool, the buttons, smooth and warm like river stones. I closed my eyes and remembered him swaying gently in the doorway, glass of whiskey in hand, his voice trembling as he gave that toast to my girls, the two loves of my life. And yet, after he passed, she barely came. She said she couldn't stand the house, too many memories, too much grief. But she didn't take anything of his, not a photo, not a letter, not even that coat. So I wore it, sometimes, late at night, just to feel him near me. The day I knew things were truly broken, not cracked, not strained, but broken, was the day of my birthday. Not a big one, just 76, not old enough to be celebrated, I suppose, and too old to be remembered. I baked myself a lemon cake, the kind Sarah used to love. When she was little, she'd eat it warm from the oven, crumbs sticking to her cheeks, eyes bright with joy. I left a slice out for her that night, just in case. I even lit a candle by the window like I used to when she stayed out past curfew, a soft little beacon calling her home. But no one came. The candle burned down to a stub, the slice sat untouched, and in the morning, it was stale. Something shifted inside me that day. It wasn't rage. I'm not sure I ever really felt angry, not the way people think of anger, with fists and shouts. Mine was quieter, like an ache in your chest. You stop noticing until it becomes part of your breathing. That week, I packed up every photo in the hallway, the baby pictures, the school portraits, the wedding frame. I wrapped them gently in newspaper and tucked them into a box I marked with one word, before the forgetting, before the rejection, before I became a story no one wanted to remember. Winter came heavy that year, thicker than usual, like the sky couldn't quite let go of its sorrow. Snow piled high against the porch, and I stayed inside, wrapped in old quilts and older silence. One evening, I caught my reflection in the window, and barely recognized myself. There's something about being unloved that changes your face. The way your eyes settle, the way your mouth holds still, even when you're smiling. I used to be a woman people looked at, not because I was beautiful, but because I was present. I filled a room with my laugh, with my humming while I cooked, with the way I remembered everyone's favorite dessert. Now, even I barely looked at me. That's when the letters started. I found the first one in the mailbox. No return address, just my name written in careful script. Inside was a single sheet of paper, with only 4 words, "You are not forgotten." At first, I thought it was a mistake. Someone meant it for another Evelyn, perhaps, or maybe it was one of those church kindness campaigns, a stranger doing a good deed. But something about the handwriting felt familiar, like a whisper from a dream you can't quite place. Then came the second letter, a week later. I remembered the rain boots, and just like that, my knees went weak, because only Sarah knew about the rain boots, the red ones I bought her when she was 5. She'd stomped through every puddle in them like a tiny queen, her laughter echoing through the neighborhood. She wore them until her toes curled up inside. I'd saved them, of course. I had tucked away in the attic, waiting for a granddaughter who might love them just as much. I climbed up there that night, hands trembling, heart racing, and found the box, still there, still closed, still holding those scuffed little boots. The letters kept coming, the cinnamon in your pies, the lullaby with the stars. Your hands, always warm, each one tore me open and stitched me back together in the same breath. I didn't know what they meant. I didn't know if it was a trick or a treasure, but I clung to them like a lifeline. I slept with them under my pillow. I read them aloud in the empty house. I even answered one, just in case, whispering into the quiet night, "If you remember, then why did you leave?" No reply came, and yet, I waited, because maybe that's what love is. In the end, not the grand gestures, not the birthdays or the gifts. Maybe it's just remembering. Maybe it's the ache that stays behind when someone walks away, proof that they mattered, and that you did too. But I also knew, deep in my bones, that remembering alone wasn't enough. Not anymore. The betrayal had happened. The quilt had been discarded. The phone calls had been ignored. And no matter how many sweet memories you pour into a letter, they can't patch the hole made by absence. So I stood in the doorway one morning, holding the letters in my hand, and I made a decision. I would find out who was sending them. I would follow that thread wherever it led, even if it dragged me through more sorrow, because silence had ruled too long, and I had stories that deserved to be told. After the quilt ended up by the trash bin, something inside me stopped waiting. I no longer lingered by the phone. I no longer flinched at the mail slot hoping for a note, or a card, or anything that had her handwriting on it. The silence had already wrapped itself around my shoulders like a shawl, and rather than shaking it off, I decided to wear it. There were bills to pay. I couldn't afford to collapse. The pension barely covered the roof above my head, and with the arthritis curling my fingers tighter every winter, even cooking a stew took twice the time it used to. But still, I did it. I found ways. I learned which days the butcher offered leftover bones for broth. I joined the church knitting circle not for prayer but because they handed out grocery vouchers. In brown envelopes tucked into hymnals, I sewed for people buttons, hymns, full skirts, whatever they needed. I stitched until my knuckles burned. I ironed clothes for women too busy to care for their own, and folded those garments so neatly you'd think I was folding back a part of myself into every crease. The house stayed clean, not because anyone would visit, but because I refused to let dust take root before I did. Every morning, I'd scrub the sink, sweep the floor, and set out 2 cups of tea, one for me, and one for the ghost of someone who used to sit with me. I knew no one was coming, but that second cup, it kept the hope warm, even if untouched. Some nights I walked to the mailbox just to hear the gravel crunch under my shoes, a small sound, but one that reminded me I was still here, still standing. Winter came hard that year, the kind of cold that seeps through window frames and into the bones of the house, and the woman who lives in it. The heater sputtered. I layered old sweaters over nightgowns and slept beneath 3 quilts. Not one of them the one I made for her. That one, I'd folded and tucked into the attic with the Christmas ornaments and the cradle. I'd rocked both her and Daniel in. Some things hurt too much to look at every day. Then came the morning I collapsed outside the back steps, slipped on ice, a basket of laundry spilling into the snow, my breath knocked clean out of me, and for a terrifying second, I thought, this is it, this is how I'll go, frozen, alone, with Daniel's boxer shorts scattered around me like fallen flags from a forgotten kingdom. But I didn't go. I crawled, inch by bitter inch. I clawed my way back inside, wet to the bone, my hands torn from the grit of the concrete, my pride shattered. But I got up, and I folded every piece of clothing that had landed in the snow, wrung them out, laid them across every surface in the kitchen to dry, because someone had to. There was no applause for any of this, no medal, no daughter banging on the door, crying, "Mama, I'm so sorry." No, the phone remained silent. The mailbox stayed empty, and I kept living anyway, and that's the part no one likes to talk about. Sweetheart, the middle, not the betrayal, not the triumph, just the endless, bone-deep ache of survival, of making toast for one, of mending the hem on your own nightgown because no one else will notice if it drags, of answering the door to strangers offering you flyers, but never family-bearing flowers. Still, I rose. Every day, I fed the birds even when I could barely feed myself. I crocheted scarves for the shelter, Wrote letters to women in prison through the church program, even though no one wrote me back. I did it because someone had to, because that's what you do when love doesn't come back. You love anyway, not for them, for yourself. Some mornings I would sit by the window, watching the neighbor's porch light flicker on just before sunrise, and I'd imagine what it might feel like to be needed again, not wanted out of guilt or obligation, just needed to have someone call out, "Mama, can you help me with this?" Or "Grandma, tell me how you used to do it." But the only sounds that filled the house were the creaks of wood settling in the walls, and the quiet ticking of a kitchen clock that didn't care whether I lived or died. I'd fill the day with tasks. That was my medicine. Tasks meant movement, and movement meant time passed. And if time passed, then maybe I wouldn't feel the ache quite so sharp by dusk. I polished the furniture with old t-shirts, swept the walkway twice, and rearranged the pantry cans by color and date. Anything to distract the mind from whispering, "They've forgotten you. You're invisible now." On Wednesdays, I walked to the pharmacy, not just for prescriptions, but for the warm silence of the aisles. I'd let my fingers run over shampoo bottles and soap bars, even if I couldn't afford them. And sometimes I'd buy a single chocolate bar just so the cashier would ask how my day was going. Her name was Kim. She wore glitter on her eyelids and had chipped red nails. One time, she gave me a packet of tea she said her mother used to love. I thanked her, then went home and cried into my cup because the gesture hurt more than the silence. When the water heater burst in the dead of January, I had 2 heat kettles on the stove just to wash myself. I slipped on the tiles one night. My elbow turned purple for weeks, but I never told anyone. Who would I have told? The loneliness had become so familiar by then, it felt like my shadow. I even spoke to it sometimes. I started writing letters I never mailed. Not just to her, to all of them. To Daniel, to Margaret, even to Tom, my husband, who'd passed 15 years before. I wrote until my hands cramped, told them everything, every pain, every memory. I sealed each letter in an envelope, dated them, and placed them in an old shoebox beneath the bed. I told myself, if they ever want to know who I was, truly know, they'll find these. But part of me doubted they'd ever bother looking. Every now and then, I'd get an invitation to something, a wedding, a baby shower, usually out of obligation, rarely followed by a phone call. I stopped going. I couldn't bear to sit in a corner while people I once held in my arms introduced me to strangers as the grandmother, like I was a relic, an antique brought out for show. I had names, stories, sacrifices carved into the lines on my face, but none of it seemed to matter anymore. But here's the strange thing, sweetheart, I never stopped giving, not once. I baked bread for the woman down the street after her miscarriage. I brought soup to the widower next door when his dog passed. I donated the last good blanket I had to a family whose house burned down. Not because I had plenty, I had nothing, but because even in my nothingness, I still had something they needed. My heart hadn't gone hollow, not yet. There was one winter where I had to choose between heating the house or buying new shoes. I chose the heat. My soles were worn so thin, I could feel the gravel pierce through like glass. But I wrapped plastic bags around my socks, slid my feet into those shoes, and walked to the library each day, just to sit somewhere warm. I read books I'd already read 100 times, just to remember how words could still hold beauty, just to hear someone else's story and forget my own for an hour. Sometimes, I sat near the children's section, not to watch them, no, never that, just to listen. The laughter, the shouting, the clatter of little feet across the linoleum. It reminded me of Daniel when he was young, his breath fogging up the windows as he waited for snow. I'd close my eyes and pretend I was back there, in the chaos, in the warmth. Just for a moment, I learned how to fix a leaky sink, how to reseal windows, how to trim branches that scraped the roof. I grew strong in ways I never expected. Not loud strength, not the kind you see in movies, no. Mine was the quiet strength of a woman who survives the worst days without witnesses. The kind of strength that doesn't demand applause, only silence, enough to breathe through the pain and do the dishes anyway. And yet, I never hardened. I never let the coldness of being forgotten turn me cruel. That, to me, would have been the final defeat. No, I held on to softness. I still smiled at strangers, still said God bless you to the bus driver, even when I knew he wouldn't remember me tomorrow, because my heart, though cracked, was still beating, still capable of love. One afternoon, the ceiling started to drip from a storm that settled over the town for days. I dragged a rusted pot from under the sink and placed it beneath the leak. Plink, plink. The sound echoed through the house like a clock counting down the seconds of my solitude. I sat across the room and stared at it, thinking, well, at least something in this house still remembers how to speak. I wanted to call someone, just to hear a voice. I even picked up the phone and dialed my daughter's number, but I didn't press send. I just stared at her name on the screen, until my eyes blurred and my finger trembled and I put the phone back down without a sound. She was probably busy, or tired, or just not in the mood to pretend. The days bled into each other, soft and gray, like old linens left on the line too long. But I made myself walk every evening, even when my joints burned and the cold nipped through my sleeves. I'd circle the block, hands tucked into my coat, nodding to dogs behind fences and waving to porch lights that blinked twice if I passed by at the same time. It was my ritual, my tether to time, my way of saying, I'm still here. You haven't erased me yet. I remember the night the heater gave out. The cold crept in like a thief. I wore 3 sweaters and curled beneath a pile of quilts I'd made decades ago, scraps of dresses, shirts from when the children were small, a piece of Tom's old flannel. I whispered their names as I traced the patches. Each square held a memory, a spilled bowl of soup, a birthday candle, a fight over who got the last pancake. So many small, noisy moments, and now, just me, holding them like ghosts. And still, I didn't break. I boiled water on the stove to keep my hands warm. I taped the windows with plastic I found in the shed. I slept with socks over my hands. I didn't cry that night, not even once, not because I wasn't sad. Oh, I was hollowed out from the inside. But I refused to give the cold the satisfaction of my tears. I was too stubborn for that, or maybe just too proud. Then came the pneumonia. The fever hit me fast and hard. I lay in bed for 3 days, sweating through my nightgown, unable to stand without collapsing. I didn't call for help. Not because I didn't want to, but because I knew no one would come. I kept a jug of water by my side and willed myself to sip every hour. My lips cracked, my throat burned. I hallucinated my mother sitting at the foot of the bed, humming the lullaby she used to sing when I was small. Hush now, hush, hush. Even the moon is sleeping. When I finally stood again, it was like coming back from the grave. I walked to the mirror, looked at my face, pale, drawn, hair clinging to my temples, and I whispered, "You're not done yet, old girl, not yet." Then I smiled. Not because there was joy, but because I had lived through something no one would ever know about, and that meant I was still stronger than the silence. I started saving every penny after that, canceled my magazine subscription, ate rice and beans 3 nights a week, sold some of my old jewelry, nothing precious, just what I thought they might pawn one day anyway. I saved enough to fix the heater, paid the man in cash. He asked if anyone was home to sign the receipt, and I said, "You're looking at her." He nodded, not really listening. But I was proud. That warmth in the walls, I bought that. I earned it. There were nights I sat on the porch in that warmth, watching stars blink into view like tiny messengers from a past that still remembered me, and I'd think, isn't it strange, the things we survive when no one's watching? Sometimes, I'd catch myself humming a lullaby, or folding a towel the way my mother used to. Muscle memory, of a life that had long moved on without me. The world had changed, my children had changed. The air even smelled different now, like chemicals and pavement instead of cut grass and wood smoke. But my heart, that stayed the same, still soft, still stitched together with tiny threads of hope. Once, at the church food pantry, a woman younger than my daughter turned to me and said, "You're always smiling. I don't know how you do it." And I wanted to tell her everything, the letters, the fevers, the cold, the silence. But instead, I just said, "Because every breath is proof I made it through something." She didn't understand. Not really. But that's the thing about survival, sweetheart. It doesn't come with trumpets or applause. It just comes with the next morning, with standing up, even when your knees scream, with fixing the sink, even when no one's going to thank you, with loving, even when they forget your name. There was an old oak tree at the edge of the field, behind my house, gnarled and bent, with a scar down one side, where lightning had struck it long before I moved in. Every year, in spring, it still blossomed, not with grandeur, not like the younger trees, but with these stubborn little buds that came up like whispers. I'm still here. I still belong. One afternoon, I walked out to it. My legs ached and I had to rest twice along the way, but I made it. I stood beneath its crooked limbs and pressed my palm against the bark. It was rough, warm from the sun, alive. I leaned my forehead against it and closed my eyes, and in that quiet, with the wind moving through its branches like an old song, I felt something I hadn't in a long time. Not joy, not peace, but dignity, a kind of dignity that only comes from having nothing left to prove. Because I did survive, not as some brave, mighty thing, but as a woman who got up each day, fed herself, warmed her own bones, and kept breathing, even when no one remembered she was still here. I lived in the spaces between the stories people told in the hallway outside, their laughter, in the missed phone calls, the unopened cards, the glances that slid past me like I was part of the wallpaper. But I never stopped being real, and I never stopped being, and some nights, when the house was too quiet and my eyes wouldn't close, I'd whisper into the dark, "You didn't break me, none of you did," not to spite them, not anymore, but to remind myself that I had walked through fire and come out the other side, not unburned, but still standing. People think survival is dramatic, that it looks like battle scars and wild speeches and bold declarations, but no, survival, real survival, is a woman, alone, at her kitchen table, slicing apples with shaking hands for a pie no one will eat. But her, it's paying the gas bill with coins. It's remembering birthdays no one remembers back. It's saving the last piece of cake for a visitor who never comes, and even then, smiling. That's what I did, not because I was strong, but because I refused to disappear. It started with a letter. Not the kind I used to send. Not one of my careful cursive envelopes that sat unopened on my daughter's mantel. No, this one came in a plain white envelope, smudged at the corners, with my name typed neatly on the front, as if whoever wrote it hadn't dared to write it by hand. There was no return address, only a faded postmark from another state and a single stamp, crooked like it had been licked and stuck in a rush. I opened it at the kitchen table, the same table where I'd once laid out birthday cakes that no one came to cut, where I'd eaten dinner with the sound of the TV to keep me company. My hands trembled as I unfolded the paper. It wasn't long, just a paragraph. "No dear, no, sincerely, just, you don't know me, but I believe I'm your granddaughter. My father's name is Adam. He always told me he didn't have a mother. I think he lied." My lungs locked. My heart thudded so loud I could hear it in my ears. Adam. He hadn't spoken my name in over 3 decades. The boy I carried in my arms while the whole town whispered. The boy I raised alone when his father went off with another girl and never looked back. The boy I protected, clothed, fed, soothed through fevers, scolded through tantrums, and held close when the world was too much. The boy who, at 20, changed his last name, moved away, and told anyone who asked that he was an orphan. That boy had a daughter, and she was looking for me. I didn't move for a long time. I just sat there with the letter in my lap and the kind of stillness that only comes after grief has been exhaled so many times it's turned into muscle memory. I read it again and again. That night, I didn't sleep. I boiled water for tea. I never drank. I sat on the edge of my bed with the hallway lights still on, just in case the darkness might close in. My chest ached, but not from pain, from hope, the kind of quiet, almost painful hope that dares to rise after years of telling itself it had no right to. The next morning, I wrote back. I kept it simple. No pleading, no bitterness, just, "Yes, sweetheart, I am," and I gave her my phone number. Her name was Eliza. She was 23, studying history, had a laugh that rang through the line like church bells in spring, clear and curious. She said she'd found some old papers tucked in a box, her father's baptism certificate, a birth record, a few photos he must have forgotten to throw away. One of them, she said, was of me younger, eyes bright, holding a baby on my hip in front of a worn porch. She asked me if I remembered. Sweetheart, I never forgot. We talked for hours that first night. I told her about the blanket I sewed for Adam's first bed, the way he used to cry when I left the room, and the little scar above his eyebrow from where he fell trying to climb the bookshelf. She soaked it all in, hungry for the pieces her father never gave her. And then she said something that nearly broke me. "He always said he came from nothing, but now I see he came from you." That's when the tears came, not the sharp, bitter kind that fall from betrayal, but the old, weary kind that only fall when your heart cracks open from something too soft, too sacred, to carry alone. A week later, Eliza sent more photos, scans, a handwritten note, not hers, but his, dated back to 1987, folded 100 times, a scrap of lined paper that said, "I'm sorry I left. I just didn't want to be the man they thought I was." She made me feel small, like I wasn't enough. But I think about her, I think about Ma, I wonder if she's still waiting. God help me if she is. He never sent it, but he wrote it, and that meant something. It meant I hadn't imagined it, the weight in his goodbye, the way he couldn't look me in the eye. It meant he didn't hate me, not entirely. It meant shame had built a wall, and pride kept the gate locked. But inside, somewhere, the boy I raised still remembered I existed. Then came the call, not from Eliza, from a lawyer. Adam had passed a sudden heart attack, just 3 weeks before Eliza found my name. In his will, buried at the very end, there was a note that read, "If she's still alive, give her this," a small box, inside, a key, a photograph of me from 1974, and a ring, his father's ring, the one I thought he'd pawned, the one his father gave him before walking out of our lives, the one Adam used to play with when he couldn't sleep, rolling it between his fingers, saying, "I don't want to end up like him." And there it was, returned to me, 3 decades later. That key, it turned out, belonged to a storage unit in Missouri. I was 7 when I boarded the train, shaky, unsure, but too full of purpose to sit still. Eliza met me at the station. She was taller than I'd expected, wore her hair in braids like I used to when I was young, and when she saw me, she ran to me with open arms and said, "Grandma." I hadn't heard that word in years. I stood there on the platform, holding this girl I'd never met, and yet felt like I'd known forever, and I thought, maybe survival wasn't the end of the story, maybe it was just the beginning. The letter had sat on the edge of the table for 2 days before I found the courage to open it. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but his surname was enough to set my hands trembling. It was postmarked from a city I hadn't stepped foot in since the day I last held him in my arms. I read it slowly, once, then again. It was from a woman named Claudia, not a stranger, not exactly. She called herself his partner, not wife, not girlfriend, just partner. That's what they say these days, don't they? Cold little labels to explain warm, messy things. She wrote with a formality that felt rehearsed, like maybe she'd written and torn up a dozen drafts before settling on this one. She said she had questions, said she hoped it wasn't too forward, hoped I was well, hoped I could shed light on a few things her partner never seemed to talk about. It was the kind of letter that circles you like a wolf, polite in tone but sharp with implication. And I knew right then, he hadn't told her who I really was, or worse, maybe he didn't even know himself anymore. I sat there all afternoon with that letter, the sun crawling slowly across the floor like a clock I couldn't escape. My teacup went cold, untouched. I didn't cry, not then. The tears would come later, but not for the reasons I thought. Because, my sweethearts, the cruelest truths aren't shouted in anger or found in confessionals. They arrive gently, dressed in the kindness of strangers asking questions you never expected to answer. So I wrote back, not because I wanted to dredge up the past, but because something inside me whispered this might be my only chance to be remembered honestly. I told her everything, not angrily, not dramatically, just the truth, the long, quiet, kind. I told her how I raised him from the time he could barely hold up his own head, how I stitched his baby blanket myself from old flour sacks because we couldn't afford anything else, how he used to fall asleep with his cheek pressed against the beat of my heart, and how, when he first said mama, there was no one else it could have been meant for. She replied, fast, this time not typed, but handwritten, her script curling like ivy across the page. Her words were warmer now, but confused. She said he didn't remember it that way, said he'd always talked about me like I was just a woman who helped out for a while when things were tough. That I had been around but wasn't really family. I read that sentence out loud in the kitchen, just to hear how it sounded, like testing the bite of a blade before you hand it to someone. I wasn't surprised, not really, but there was something about seeing it written, hearing it aloud, that made the room go very, very quiet. I stood there, one hand still on the counter, breathing in the scent of onions and old dish soap, feeling something crumble and settle inside me like dust in the rafters. But here's the part that shook me. She wanted to meet, said she was coming into town for a work thing, and asked if I might be open to tea, just tea, no pressure. I didn't answer for 3 days, then I said yes. We met in a little place by the lake, you know the kind, doilies on the tables, waitresses with blue eyeshadow, and kind hands. Claudia arrived in a navy coat with a scarf wrapped too tight around her neck, like maybe she was preparing for the chill of a story she wasn't sure she wanted to hear. She looked like someone who carried too many questions, and I I had answers I wasn't sure I wanted to give. We talked. At first it was cautious, like walking across ice. She asked about my house, about my knitting, about the weather. Then, slowly, she asked about him, not just the facts, the feeling of him, what he was like as a boy, whether he used to laugh the way he does now, whether he was always so guarded, and I told her everything I could, every memory I thought might still have a place in his life. Every tiny tenderness I had tucked away in the corners of my mind like old photographs I was afraid to lose. She listened, really listened, and then she said something I'll never forget. She said, "He has a son, our boys for now, and he talks about you. Sometimes, in fragments. He says, I think I had a mother once, before everything changed. Before everything changed." That was the turning key, my dears. The moment I realized he hadn't forgotten me entirely. He had buried me, rewritten the chapters, maybe to protect himself. Maybe because someone told him a version of the story that made it easier to live with. But inside, somewhere deep, he still remembered, just enough to wonder, just enough to tell a child, "I think I had a mother once." I left that cafe feeling heavier than I went in, but not in the way you might expect. It wasn't grief anymore. It was something quieter, like the echo of music you can't quite place, but know you once loved. I didn't need to confront him anymore, not in the dramatic way I once imagined. I'd spent too many years with that weight strapped to my back. I wasn't chasing apologies, I was chasing clarity, and in her eyes, in the way Claudia held my hand as we parted, I saw something I hadn't seen in a long time. A door I thought was sealed shut, was still cracked open, just wide enough to let in a bit of air. I used to think that silence was safer than pain, that keeping still, keeping small was how a woman survived a world that never truly made space for her heart. But when the truth finally settled, like dust in the sunlight, I found myself standing at the edge of something even more terrifying than grief. Choice, not the kind they talk about in magazines or books. This wasn't about reinventing myself or starting a new chapter. No, this was a different kind of choice, the kind that comes only after a lifetime of being reshaped by everyone else's needs, the kind that makes your hands tremble not because you're weak, but because you're finally holding the pen that writes the last lines of your story. I could have told everyone, I had every right. I had the letters, the photographs, the birth record with his mother's name crossed out in ink and mine written neatly below, as if love alone could rewrite bloodlines. I had the neighbor's testimony, the file from the hospital, even the old wooden cradle he slept in the first night I brought him home, the one I never let anyone throw away. He had lived his life on the backbone of my sacrifices, and then introduced me to his wife, as someone from the past. My hands shook for days after that, but then something strange happened. I sat at the kitchen table one morning, the same one I had scrubbed for 60 years, and the light came through the curtain just so I could hear birds in the back hedges, the hum of the refrigerator, the soft ticking of the clock, and suddenly, I didn't feel rage anymore. I felt tired, not the kind of tired that sleep fixes, but the bone-deep kind, the one that comes after carrying too many people for too long and realizing you never once let yourself be carried. All my life, I'd worked hard to be good, a good daughter, a good wife, a good mother, even when it broke me. But in that moment, I stopped asking whether I was good. I asked, finally, was I whole? And the answer wasn't what I expected. Because no, I wasn't whole, not yet, but for the first time in decades, I wanted to be, not for him, not for closure, but for me. So I made a decision. I took all the evidence, every letter, every photograph, every ugly truth I had held like a shield, and I placed them carefully in a box. Then I wrapped that box in the quilt I made the winter after his birth. The ones stitched with pieces of my old dresses, the ones he used to tug at when he was just learning to walk. I didn't burn it, I didn't send it to his house. I took it to the attic, walked past the old rocking chair, and tucked it into the cedar chest my mother gave me when I got married. Not to bury it, but to release it. Because sometimes justice isn't about punishment. Sometimes it's about letting go of the hope that the past can ever repay what it took. Sometimes it's about choosing peace, even when no one offers an apology. And here's the part no one tells you. Peace doesn't feel like joy. Not at first. It feels like quiet, like an ache that's no longer sharp, just present, a knowing, a gentleness. You begin to show yourself because no one else thought to. In the end, I did not tell him. I let him live in his version of the story, because I was done living inside of someone else's silence. I went back to the garden. I wrote letters to friends I had neglected. I cooked stew on Sundays and lit a candle at dusk just for me. I stopped waiting to be called, remembered, forgiven, or seen. I saw myself. And wouldn't you know it was enough? Sweethearts, if you're still here, thank you for listening to my story. If you've ever been forgotten, overlooked, or mislabeled as just someone from the past, you're not. Your life matters, your love mattered, and your story deserves to be heard. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from. And don't forget to like and subscribe. These stories, they deserve to live on. He said I was his angel. I believed him, not because I was naive, not because I didn't know better, but because love, when you're young, wraps itself around your ribs like ivy. It doesn't ask permission, it just grows, green and full and reckless, until one day, it either blooms into something beautiful, or strangles the very breath out of you, and in my case, maybe it did a little of both. I think about that now, in the quiet moments, when the kettle's whistling in the kitchen, or the evening sun paints the wall with that soft, golden light that always made the house feel warmer than it really was. I sit in my chair, fingers curled around my cup, and I ask myself the questions I never had time for before. Did it matter? All the sleepless nights, the little sacrifices, the years I spent giving and giving, only to be remembered as someone from the past. Did it mean anything? And the strange, gentle truth that settled in my chest like a bird returning home is yes, it mattered, because love, even if unreturned, leaves fingerprints. It makes quilts warmer. It makes soup taste like home. It teaches babies their first lullabies and teenagers their first bit of kindness. It carries people through things they never even realized they survived. He may not remember the prayers I whispered over his crib, but I do. He may not know that every time he got sick in school, it was my coat they wrapped him in, but I do. And maybe that's enough. We spend so much of our lives begging the world to witness us, to see us, to name our pain, our beauty, our sacrifice. But in the end, the most sacred kind of knowing is the kind we carry ourselves quiet, undemanding, complete. I didn't get a thank you. I didn't get a letter, or a tearful apology, or a moment where he finally saw me for all I was. But I got something else. I got to live a life that was mine. Even if it was hard, even if it was lonely, even if the people I loved most turned away. When I needed them most, I stayed, I stitched, rocked, endured, believed. I sang lullabies in dark rooms. I made dinners out of scraps. I sent birthday cards even when they went unanswered. I told the truth when it trembled on my tongue like glass. And I loved, deeply, fiercely, without condition or reward. That, sweethearts, is something no one can take from you, even if they forget your name, even if they call you dramatic, or too much, or not enough, even if they rewrite the story and leave you out of the final chapter. Your love is still carved into the walls of every life you touched. I used to think I was waiting for closure, but what I was really waiting for was permission to stop hoping they'd come back, to stop needing the past to be fair, to stop apologizing for being soft in a world that only praised the hard and loud. And now, sitting here, my back a little bent, my hands full of memories, I don't need permission anymore, because I remember who I was. I remember the girl who sewed late into the night so the boy could have warm pajamas. I remember the woman who stood in courtrooms, in kitchens, in silence for the sake of someone she loved more than herself. And I remember the grandmother, now, who finally chose peace. Let that be the lesson, my darlings. Not that love will always be returned, because sometimes it won't be. Not that the truth will always rise, because sometimes it stays buried. But that you, in all your quiet persistence, are still whole, still holy, still worthy, even if no one ever tells you so. So light the candle at dusk. Write your name in your favorite book. Hum the lullaby, just for you this time. And when you see your reflection in the window, the one with the lines and the years and the sorrow and the grace, smile at her. She's not someone from the past. She's someone who survived. If you stayed with me through the whole story, thank you, my sweethearts. It means more than you know. Please tell me in the comments what parts stayed with you, and if you haven't already, don't forget to like and subscribe. These stories, they carry all our hearts. Let's keep them alive.